When you start as a developer, you hear a lot about Git and services like GitHub. In this short video, I explain why you need Git and how to use it in your projects. When you start a new project, you need to put your file somewhere. No matter if you're using your local machine or a cloud IDE, you are going to use a file system of some sort. Simply put, it's a set of files and folders, and it allows you to store the current state of your files. You change a file and save it to load it later with the changes you've made. But what you really need is to be able to track these changes over time. If you learned the basics of coding, I'm pretty sure you've heard about Git, or at least about GitHub, which is a service built on top of Git. Git is a command line tool created to track code changes, and it's really good at it. That's why almost every developer uses it. Let's see why. I know it may sound terrifying, but there were times when Git didn't exist, so developers like us had to survive somehow. To be fair, similar tools became available a long time ago, and they're still here nowadays. But when I started coding, I had no idea about them. So I ended up with folders named V1, V2, V3, or it could be weird like V1 Final or V2 Temp. So first, it's hard to figure out where my latest changes are. Second, if I had to fix something in V1 and port it to V2, or the other way around, I would have ended in a messy file comparison between two folders. My point is that you don't want to go this route. Git is one of those tools that people would try and then say, how have I lived without it? However, Git doesn't look like the easiest tool to learn at first. I remember reading Git documentation for the first time and I was like, it sounds wonderful, but how am I supposed to use this? The theory looked good, but I didn't really know how to put it in practice. Thankfully, I found a great blog post about using Git in a real project. This approach is called Git Flow, and it became very popular. But things have changed a bit. And unless you need to support multiple versions of your application at the same time, I suggest you take a look at a much simpler model called GitHub Flow. It allows you to continuously deploy your code to production instead of waiting for a dedicated release. Let's see how it works. In Git, separate code storage is called a repository. This is where Git stores all your files and the history of changes. A single entry in this history is called a commit. You decide what goes into one commit. It could be just one line of code in a file, or several new files at once, which may not be the best idea, but we'll talk about it in a minute. Say you're working on building a web application. Imagine you have your production server somewhere. You need a place in your repository to keep a copy of the code that runs in production. If something bad happens to your server, and you don't have a backup, you can restore your application from this copy. And if you find a bug in the production version, you know exactly which code you need to fix. Also, you need a place in your repository to store the code you are currently working on. This way, you keep it separate from your production code. You will probably need a few spots like that for different ideas and experiments. All those places that I mentioned are called branches in Git. They are like separate spaces that don't affect each other. But when you're done with your changes, you can merge branches together. In GitHub Flow model, each of them has its name. The main branch is the one that holds a copy of your production code. People used to call it the master branch, but now the term main is getting more popular. This is the only permanent branch in your repository. All the other branches are usually called feature or fix branches, depending on what you're working on. But it's totally up to you how to name them. Just keep in mind that the name should be descriptive enough, especially if you work together with someone else. Now that we know the branch structure, let's see how it all plays together. You start by creating a new branch based on your code in the main branch. You put all your changes in the form of commits there. When your feature or fix is complete, you can merge it back to the main branch. Git does it for you automatically with a simple command. From there, you can add additional steps to make sure your code works correctly before you deploy it to your production server. Now that we know what the workflow looks like, let's see how we should go about commits. Say you've been working on your project for a while, and one day you find a bug in your code, which is, let's face it, inevitable. Now you need to go back in history and find a specific change. Now, what would work better? You can go through smaller changes one by one, Or you can look at multiple changes across a few files all at once. Well, usually you need both at the same time. You need to pinpoint the change, but the surrounding context helps you understand what you were doing exactly back then. You need to store smaller changes in your repository to have these options. Ultimately, it means that you need to make your commits smaller. So if you want to go back in time, you can pick a specific commit and just ask Git to show you the files in that exact state. You can also compare one commit to another and see the changes between them. If you think of commits as an undo history in your editor, I bet you'd like to undo one small change at a time. When you work on your code, you use a repository on your local machine. That's perfectly fine. Technically, you don't need to use any online services like GitHub or Bitbucket. But there are some benefits to these services. First, it's a good idea to have a backup of your code on a remote system. Second, you can pull the code from this repository to any machine. If you have two computers, a laptop and a desktop, it's a great way to keep everything in sync. Also, with online services, you can set up an automated process to run the tests, run the build, and deploy your code to different environments. And believe me, automation is huge. There are different code management platforms out there, including GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket. So you can choose whatever works best for you. The best part is that you can use them for free. And whenever you add new commits, don't forget to push them to the remote repository. The last thing I want to mention is applications that let you manage your repositories with a graphical UI. This way, you get a nice view of all your branches and commits. You can do operations like merging, interactive rebasing, rolling back, and so on. You can use a free one like GitKraken or a commercial one like Tower. Keep in mind though that if, for instance, you need to run Git on a remote Linux server with a command line, you still need to use Git commands manually. So I'd suggest you learn at least basic Git commands. Eventually, it may come in handy. Git looks like a tough tool to learn at first, but don't worry, you'll get a grasp on it over time. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Let me know in the comments down below if you'd like to learn more on this topic or anything else about software development. See you next time!